I hate to say it, but the more I think about it, I think this sort of movement to claim indigenous status by black people is really driven by dumb people. Like, I hate to say this, but it is true that for the most part, conspiracy theories sort of like gain traction with people who are not as intelligent, people who lack critical thinking skills. It's just easier for people who don't have critical thinking skills to adapt to conspiracy theories. And so this whole idea that the transatlantic slave trade was just somehow made up, no matter how much documentation is, we just made it all up, and where's the ships, all the dumb talking points that they give. I just think you have to be like not that intelligent to rock with that. And here's a perfect example. One of their favorite arguments is, we were all reclassified. We was here, but black people, the natives, we were reclassified to black. Okay, well, you're either dumb or dishonest if you make that statement. And here's why I say that. Let's just start basic. If you're a black man, right, or you identify as a black man, the government came to you tomorrow and said, you know what, we are going to reclassify you as a trans woman. Would you just say, yes, sir, master, I'm a trans woman? No, you wouldn't do that. Like, nobody would do that. In the same way, actual indigenous people to the United States, they didn't do that either. Where you find legitimate cases of reclassification, there's a well-documented history that those people fought back for a long time, decades, whatever it took, because they wanted federal tribal recognition. That was important. So that theory assumes people accepted this new identity, but it also assumes that all these black people walking around were unaware that they were reclassified, which is also just a ridiculous notion. When you really start to study this, for the most part, the reclassification efforts, they're not like in 1600. A lot of these are very recent in history, historically speaking. So the idea that millions of black people just had no clue, because again, I just told you, the Native Americans who were reclassified, they were very aware that they were reclassified and they fought it. So if you're reclassified, like, you would know that. And so the idea that black folk everywhere, sitting around Atlanta and Detroit or at Thanksgiving, and grandma just forgot to tell us that we was reclassified, it is just an utterly absurd idea. It's just ridiculous. But when you get into the particulars of reclassification, the big one that they like to point to is Walter Plecker in 1924 in Virginia. He introduces this, whole Racial Integrity Act, where they basically, yes, they go and try to reclassify a lot of natives to black. That actually happened. Now, there's a lot of specifics that I can't really get into, but sure, on the surface, okay, that's 1924. Walter Plecker dies in the 40s. Again, people would know they were reclassified. This isn't ancient history. But let's be clear, this applied only to the state of Virginia. And the number of people this applies to, these are not millions of people. This is a relatively small number of people within the whole population of the state of Virginia. Even so, yes, they fought back over decades because, again, they're wanting federal tribal recognition. And many of those people were successful. Some not as much. But for the most part, people fought and they were, they knew what was happening and they fought it. Even to the degree that people may not have been as successful or it took longer, again, just because it's not what you call me, it's what I answer to. They didn't answer to that. If you look at history, there's nowhere where Native Americans are like, I really would like to be black. You have the five civilized tribes that literally have black slaves. So, I mean, clearly, they're not trying to be black. And it's not just anti-blackness. What I'm saying is, within indigenous nations, there's as much anti-blackness as anywhere else. Not all of America is anti-black. There's enough of it, though, right? Beyond that, it's not even about being anti-black. It's just, I'm not going to answer to something that I'm not. If you say I'm a trans woman, I'm not answering that because I'm not a trans woman. It is an utterly ridiculous notion. Beyond Virginia, though, you do have, for the most part, isolated cases where maybe census records or other groups that you have some type of reclassification. But again, let's just say that they all say, yes, master, we're going to be reclassified now. You're still talking about people in the few thousands. You're not talking millions, right? We're talking thousands. The idea that somehow people reclassified in 1920, 1930 even some in a few earlier censuses. If I'm going to be very charitable, and let's just assume that's true. We could count, but let's just say you have people in 1800 census who are reclassified. Okay, you're still talking about numbers that get you into several thousands. You're not getting to millions of black people today. Like, it's just a ridiculous. So again, are you dumb or just dishonest? One of those things is true. This is the kind of thinking that we have. I have people who fight me, particularly on TikTok, and they just come with all these crazy talking points that you would have to be dumb to make. You would have to just not be that intelligent. And so, you often hear the question like, okay, if you're indigenous, tell me what your language was. Because all the indigenous people that we know of, they have a documented culture, a language. Like, what's your language? I have heard people literally say English. They have literally said English that was their indigenous language because they were indigenous Americans and they spoke English. Okay. So again, I've had people say, well, I looked at this website, slavevoyages.org, and when I looked at all the journeys from Africa to America, they only had 82, so only 82 Africans came. This is what I'm saying. Like, you're either dumb or dishonest. One of those things is true. These things make no sense. And so I'm not talking to the people who believe that. Because when people are in a cult, it doesn't matter. They just choose to believe something. I've talked to people who adamantly believe in the internal slave trade, right? Particularly after 1808, when the international slave trade is abolished, you're trading internally, right? You're moving people from, let's say, West Virginia to Alabama, whatever. Now, they believe in all the documentation for the internal slave trade, but they don't believe the documentation for the transatlantic slave trade, right? Dumb or dishonest. That makes absolutely no sense. What's happening is people just want to believe something is true. Forget what the evidence is. I just want to believe that this is true. And since I want to believe it's true, I'm just going to ignore anything. Like, and so when you tell people, I tell you what, let's just settle this. Take a DNA test. Well, nah, man, you got to read all the disclaimers. Okay, so you don't accept DNA. You don't accept the endless mountains of scholarship on the transatlantic slave trade, all the documentation. And that's the other thing. They make these arguments that just absolutely make no sense. And I think when you're not intelligent, you just don't understand certain things. For example, they seem to be under the impression that the transatlantic slave trade is just some story somebody came up with. Some white guy just made up a story. What they're failing to understand, because they're not really intelligent, it's not a story. This is built on documentation. And so in their mind, some ultimately powerful white guy somewhere behind a curtain created the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of documents that substantiate this. From insurance companies, from logs, from the slave trading companies, you name it, from narratives of people who survived that journey. Like, some all-powerful white man made all of this up. Also, remember, the transatlantic slave trade is not just America. You have the Dutch, you have the Portuguese, you have the Spanish, like, you have all the British, all these different nations, all this documentation. If you went to court and 10 people had the same testimony, you say, wow, that's powerful. Well, you got all these different countries, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different entities within these countries, all saying the same thing. Dude, no all-powerful white man went behind a curtain and made up all that over hundreds of years. That's just, but when you're not critically thinking, when you're not capable of critical thinking, or when you're just so committed to believing something for what reason, I don't know. Like, they somehow believe it's a come up to be Indian. I'm not sure what that come up is. And the sad reality is, these are people who anything but African will do. I can't have African origins. Anything else is better. And I think that's quite sad. They are afraid of the actual story. They refuse the actual story, which was, yes, people were kidnapped. They were assisted by other Africans on the other side. We were transported against our will on ships. Millions died in transit. And then we had a lot of non-consensual sexual interactions with Europeans, which is why, on average, there have been several studies by several different sources, unrelated sources. Black folk are like 20 something percent European in our DNA on average. 70 something percent sub-Saharan African, right? One of the numbers I've seen, well, I've seen several numbers, but basically less than 1% Native American DNA. Trust me, you're not a Native American. Like on average, you're now. Are there some people who legitimately have some mixture? Sure, black people have all types of stories. But this idea that I'm going to cut out the African part and I have no connection, like that's just ridiculous. And so you may say, well, you don't know everyone's story. No, I don't. But we do know certain things. So, for example, I don't know everyone's individual capabilities, but I know that human beings can't fly. We just can't fly. And so if you tell me there's some mutation in someone that can fly, I'm open to it. I just need to see the evidence of that. And if you're telling me that you are a black person walking around here today who's somehow indigenous and has no connection to Africa, okay, I would just need to see the evidence of that. But when you're not intelligent, when you're into conspiracy theories, you can make ridiculous arguments, such as here's a random picture on the internet of natives that look melanated, and that's their proof. Like that's all. Now forget the fact that the picture was made by a European, like within the last 200 years. Sure, that's proof. Forget the fact, you know what I mean? Like a European made it like 100 years ago, and that's proof. They weren't there in 1500. So this is just dumb. They will take statements by early explorers and say, "Oh, we found people who were darker." Well, yeah, nobody thought the natives were white. Like I think we knew that. Furthermore, particularly in the South, these people are in the sun. They're adapting. Of course, they're going to have melanin. But there's people in India who have melanin. Are you related to them too? No. You're no longer. You're no more related to the people in India than you are the Native Americans here. And so this sort of anti-blackness, this sort of self-hatred, where you don't want to identify with who you really are, but let's just come up with a whole nother story. You're either dumb or dishonest. One of those things is true. Because these arguments make absolutely no sense. The conspiracy theory stuff makes absolutely no sense. And at the end of the day, it's like this. I need all y'all to just take some DNA tests. Like, I'm not going to argue with y'all. Just take the test. But you won't take the test because you know what it's going to say. And you rather hold on to this dumb fantasy, I don't even know what this is, cult movement that makes absolute. So I'm not talking to you all. I'm talking to reasonable, sane people. You're going to hear these dumb arguments, and I'm trying to tell you they absolutely make no sense. And here's the clinch card. Let's say, hypothetically, that Africans before Columbus came and explored the United States, not Mexico, not Central America. Let's say Africans came to the United States of America. Now, we don't have any evidence for that, but maybe it happened. I'm open. And let's say some of them stayed here. Again, we don't actually have hard evidence of that. We've had some people publish books and advance those theories, but they've not withstood peer review, and that actually matters. Black scholars have looked at this and said, yeah, a lot of this doesn't hold up. But let's say it actually happened. Just think for 2 seconds. Did those Africans come here and just sort of have their own community and just stay to themselves and keep reproducing over hundreds of years, and here we are? Or is it more likely they would have been absorbed into the other indigenous groups and would have just become part of them? So even if you have Africans who come to this country before Columbus, like that early, yeah, they would have just been absorbed with everyone else. They wouldn't have just built their own Wakanda here. And so they would have been absorbed with those tribes. And what happened to those tribes? Overwhelmingly, they were wiped out or they were moved out. Were there some Native Americans enslaved? Sure. Even in the Southeast, you do have instances of that. That was a little harder. A, they're being wiped out by disease. B, they know the land. C, if you're going to try to come enslave us, you got to fight a whole nation. That's a little harder to do, but there were some. But the reality is, that's like putting a piece of sand into a bag of sand by that point. There's so many Africans, like, they're just going to be absorbed in that. And so if you're trying to really strain and hold on to that one, and this is where the anti-blackness is, they will try their hardest to find one Native American in their genealogy and step over 100 Africans to get to that one. Just say you hate yourself. Like, just actually say you hate yourself. So, again, I'm not talking to that whole crowd. God bless y'all. I've accepted that you choose to believe conspiracy theories and loony stuff, and you're probably just not that intelligent. If you are intelligent, then you're just dishonest. I accept that. You just want this to be true for whatever reason. I'm not sure what it is, but okay. I'm talking to sane people, normal people. Do not get into this garbage. Black people need to be sober minded. We need to be honest about our condition and work from there. And making up fantasy does not serve us.